Jenna, welcome. It's such an immense pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Since we last spoke, Jenna, you have published an amazing book, Enlightened Bottom Line, which is a bestseller. So, big congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
Your book is so beautiful, and there's many questions and important points that you address in your book. And one key question that I absolutely loved was, what if the way we spend and invest could become a way to heal the world? And that's really my first question for you today. What does healing the world truly mean for you?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be back in conversation with you. And I love this question, and it's one that I come back to a lot. And I think it's less just an abstract idea and more something that on a daily basis of how are we orienting towards this healing the world and how does that show up in every aspect of what we do. And I think so much of it comes back to this idea of viewing the world like a human body and the interconnectedness of different parts of the world, and what impacts one part of the world has a huge impact on other parts of the world, and this ability to be able to see our interconnectedness. And so if one part is broken, the whole is broken. And I think of an example of a company that I have a chance to talk about in the book called Devoted Health. They're a very successful company in the healthcare space. They recently raised around at a $13 billion valuation. And they credit a lot of their success to a simple exercise, which is before any of the healthcare providers engage with any of the patients, they're encouraged to close their eyes and imagine that the patient that they're about to interact with is a beloved family member. And I think this one simple exercise of thinking about if we were to engage with people as if they're part of our family or we're all part of the same human body, what type of healing could happen in the world, and also how much more of an effective world that it could be that we could be living in. So that's something that I come back to a lot.
I love that. So beautiful. You also mention in your book that one of your mother's gifts to you was introducing you to the Baha'i faith during your formative years. Help us understand how this has shaped how you live and lead today, because I know you reference it quite a lot in the book.
Yes, it's definitely a core part of my orientation to the world. And one of the core beliefs in the Baha'i faith is the idea that the underlying spiritual teachings of all religions are the same, and that there's so much that we can learn from this power of unity and diversity. So certainly in the book, I draw upon both insights from the Baha'i teachings, but also from across different religious and spiritual traditions and how that's been oriented in people's lives. And many of the other principles include the harmony of science and religion, the abolition of extremes of wealth and poverty, the equality of men and women. And so this idea of how do we incorporate some of those principles into our daily lives and work. And one of the other core ideas is this idea that work is a form of worship. And so when I think about the investment fund I run, Lightpost Capital, or some of the facilitation work that I do within Impact Experience, it's all really centered around this idea of the power of work as a form of worship. Or some of the other principles include the power of consultation. We have no priests or clergy in the Baha'i faith. There's a lot of emphasis around independent investigation of truth, and how through the power of conversations like this, we can collectively get closer to understanding reality.
Amazing. And since you spoke earlier about the power of interconnectedness, you touched upon in your book also about how, well, let me just see. Can you see me now? Or because I'm seeing my,
It froze a little bit.
okay. So yes, it has to do with our respective internet connection. So let me just start over
Mm,
this question. Hopefully
okay, great.
all will be good. Let me just
Yeah.
double check everything. Okay, no, it didn't disconnect. Okay, let me just start over. Okay. Since you spoke earlier about the importance of interconnectedness, and you also share how spiritual principles beyond interconnectedness, but also mindfulness practices, compassion, how they need to be brought into the business world. What does that look like in practice for leaders listening today that may really want specific actions that they can begin implementing today within their teams and organizations?
This is a really important question, and I think really something that within the book try to look at these broader principles and then how are they operationalized in core practices within organizations. And a couple of examples that point to in the book. One of them is a company that I had a chance to invest in, Isuzu, an amazing company in the fintech space. They support people on the pathway towards home ownership, and they have what they call the Isuzu Credo, where they have really enshrined their values into this credo. And so when they're making decisions around how do they engage with their customer base, how do they incorporate concepts like compassion, they have this manifesto to come back to as the guidepost for making those decisions. And I really like that as an example because it becomes something where it's less just reactive to what's going on in the world, but actually a proactive set of principles that we can come back to. Another is a company called Innisfree Hotels, and they have a cultural manifesto. So it's a similar idea where they've really enshrined their cultural values into this manifesto and into the manual. And so when new employees are coming to work with them, they're trained in the cultural manual. They use that when they're making hard decisions. And some of those cultural principles are things like the power of check-ins. We can so easily get so focused on just operating in the work, but the power, and to your question about mindfulness, the power of actually taking a step back and thinking, what are we really optimizing for here? And how do we ensure that the decisions that we're making are aligned with those values? So having these daily practices that enable us to recenter around what we're really focused on becomes really important.
And it's also about, at the end of the day, bringing creativity, right? Once we have defined the values that we want to lead an organization with, we can bring our own flavor and spices as a leader as to how we want to structure that.
Exactly. And I think to your point about creativity, it's also joy and play and fun, right? Having this be something where it's not just an onerous list of things that we have to do, but rather that if we imagine we spend quite a lot of our time in the work environment, that how do we make that something that we're enjoying being part of it, we're enjoying engaging with our colleagues. And I think some of these principles enable that to really happen.
And this is such an important point, especially when I think about the latest reports that have been published, and consistently we see such low engagement scores across organizations. So there would be so much beauty and so much creativity that can emerge if we do integrate these beautiful components that you share in your book. And I was wondering if there would be one specific advice that you would give to leaders that may be struggling and that have a low engagement score today across their organization. What is one thing that you think would truly change that?
I think it's a really important question. I think it's one that, particularly to your point around many of these surveys, are finding that many people are actually optimizing not just for how much money they're making, but actually, is this something that's aligned with their purpose and their values, and that they can really see the work environment as a space where they're able to have full actualization. And I think that would tie into what my recommendation would be to companies, which is to really create the space for people to be able to share what it is that is really motivating them, and why do they do what they do, and what are they hoping to get out of the work environment. And to your earlier point on creativity, what creative ideas might they have for the actualization of some of the principles that the organization's working on, so people are really able to bring in the breadth of their skill sets into the work and are not just limited to the particular scope of work.
Why do you believe so many organizations still struggle to prioritize purpose over profits? And why is greenwashing still happening today, in your view?
I think so much of it comes back to the incentive structures and to these questions around alignment and what it is that we're really measuring. I'm really drawn towards, Bobby Kennedy gave this speech in 1968 where he was talking about gross national product. And he said, The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And I think so often when we're measuring and looking at what companies and organizations are measuring, and it really falls into a lot of what we just heard there from Bobby Kennedy of we're not necessarily measuring some of the most important dimensions of life. And while I was at business school at Stanford, I had a chance to lead a trip to Bhutan on the theme of the business of happiness. And in Bhutan, they have measurements around gross national happiness. So rather than using gross national product or gross domestic product as their measurement for success, they use gross national happiness. And they literally they call them spiritual consultants, but they're people that their focus is on supporting organizations on the implementation of these principles around gross national happiness. And I think when we're considering around this prioritization of purpose over profits is really what are we orienting towards, and also think about the indigenous conception around 7 generations thinking, and how are we considering the legacy of the 7 generations from the past, but also the impact of our decisions on the 7 generations into the future that help to be able to orient us more around purpose and meaning.
Let's dive deeper into the 7 generations. This emerged in your book as well, following a journey to the Amazon. I'm really, really curious to learn more about that journey itself and how leaders can shift their strategies from the short-term thinking we often see in business to a longer-term focus.
Yes, it was an incredible trip I had a chance to do last summer with the Pachamama Alliance to the Amazon. It was something that will stay with me for the rest of my life on many dimensions. I think this question around how are we extending to a longer time horizon is a really important one that is something for everything from for companies thinking about succession planning and how are they integrating early on in their decision-making processes, thoughts around what is the impact of some of these decisions for generations to come. And this is a really different orientation to so often the quarterly investment cycles that publicly traded companies are focused on. And so being able to hold that longer term horizon with also then shorter term decision making, and think about the example of Patagonia that set up a purpose trust where the shares of the company are held by nature in perpetuity. And so this idea of even as they continue and potentially even change ownership over the years, that there is preservation of the social and environmental mission that has been such a core part of the company. So I think being able to look at structures like that, where this longer term horizon thinking is really incorporated into decisions that are made today.
When you take that longer term horizon thinking into the work that you do every single day in terms of investing in startups that are bringing innovations in a multitude of spaces from AI to health, how do you define success for a startup? And how do you approach the regular reviews and mentoring in a different way, given the 7 generation thinking?
So we spend a lot of time with the companies that we invest into to really understand also how are they defining success and what are the key performance indicators from both a financial perspective, but also from a social and environmental perspective. We very much see the collinearity between financial returns and social and environmental impact, and very much see that as a co-created process with the companies that we're investing in. So there are certainly tools, and I think about the Global Impact Investing Network that developed the impact reporting investment standards. I think these are all really helpful benchmarks for investors to be using to consider the social and environmental impact of their portfolio, and the importance of realizing that it's not as clear cut as are you making money or are you not making money. And of course, as companies get feedback from their customer base and iterate over time, that being able to also have adaptability built into the model to be able to be responsive to what the company is learning over time as well.
What are your thoughts in terms of ventures that have a connectivity with AI in one shape or another? And on the one side, we see tremendous positive aspects related to AI. On the other, we know that it's very, very demanding and not optimal, let's just say, from an environment perspective. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you make investment choices in ventures that are fueled by AI?
I think we're in a really critical moment in time in terms of the development of AI, where exactly as you say, I think on the one hand, we have these pretty amazing potential applications of AI for good. So one of the companies that had a chance to invest in that talk about in the book is called Everty AI, and it's started by Dr. Larry Brilliant, who was part of the team that helped to eradicate smallpox and led Google.org for a while, an incredible entrepreneur. And they're really focused on personalized medicine and healthcare and how to use AI to have more adaptive health engagement. And some of the applications, particularly on the healthcare side, are really inspiring. And then on the other hand, some of these really existential challenges, and you think about exactly as you said, some of the environmental challenges with data centers, potential impacts around job loss, some of the security and privacy issues. And so I think it's a really important one. And I think everybody within the ecosystem plays a role within this. So think about the role of investors in engaging with entrepreneurs to really understand what is their strategy for both mitigating harm, but also actively using the tools for good and being able to have these really real conversations of recognizing that there's so much that we can't predict right now because the rapid pace of AI is taking place as we speak, but being able to really come back to what are the core values that are guiding how we're making decisions and how does that play out when we think about trying to balance and optimize for the good aspects and minimize some of the more challenging aspects.
What is the role, in your view, of humans in this AI era, particularly when we're talking about sustainability? Some individuals believe that AI will actually help us find the solution to dealing with the sustainability challenges that we have on a global scale. Do you believe it will be AI that will help us solve those problems, or it will be more the humans that will achieve it, or a co-creation or a combination of the AI and human efforts that will lead us to find the right path?
I think it really is the latter, this co-created effort. And I do think that there are amazing opportunities that are unlocked by us using AI to its best, and both in terms of efficiency, but also new ways of looking at problems. I was actually just with a friend of mine who's with a renewable energy company yesterday, and they were showing all of these insights that came from just being able to use AI as a way to process vast amounts of data and have a more efficient way of being able to pass through that, and then what decisions they're able to make as a result. So I don't think we're going to get to a point where we no longer need humans as part of our decision making processes and as part of so many of these companies. I'm really drawn by, there was a report that the World Economic Forum did last year where they talked about how there's going to be by 2030 a net job creation from AI of 170 million jobs. And will also be that 90 million jobs will become defunct, but that's still a 80 million net creation of jobs. And I think that's such an important part of the discourse because I think we're so often focused on, which is really important, but on the job loss that's going to be taking place, but also realizing that there's going to be a lot of job creation. And how do we ensure that we're actively retraining and repurposing so that those predictions from that report really do come to the fore? And I think it's really is in that co-created work between humans and AI.
I want to dive more into the personal stories that you have shared in the book. You talk about your grandmother, about the importance of being enough, which I think is such an important subject. Can you share that story for our audience? And how can they bring more enoughness into their own personal and professional lives?
I love this story, and it's one that I come back to a lot. So, my grandmother ran a fashion store in London, and she would often tell this story about how one day it was a very busy day and she had many customers, but she noticed that there was somebody in the store that was clearly really struggling. And so my grandmother kind of stopped what she was doing, and she created the space for this woman to process what was going on in her life, just create an opportunity for her to share what was going on her heart. And a couple of weeks later, the woman came back to the store and she said to my grandmother, that day I was thinking about taking my life, but that conversation with you convinced me to stay alive. And my grandmother would share this story and she would say, if there's nothing else that I do in my life, but I created the space for this woman, that's enough. And I am enough. And I think about that a lot because I think that so often, and so many of the things that we're talking about, right, these really big, like, how are we shaping global civilization and what is the impact of our decisions for years to come? And I think these are really important questions. And it's also in these small daily acts and how we show up to people, and that how do we hold this conception of being enough, and what is unlocked when we can really hold that enoughness in our being, and how does that then translate into how we engage with other people. So I appreciate you bringing up that story because it's definitely one that I come back to a lot.
It's interesting. I was also looking at another report that was published recently, and they were looking into how loneliness has an impact on how certain individuals were experiencing the usage of AI, and how the more lonelier individuals were, the more they looked at AI for connection rather than for humans. And some began even calling the AI like my work colleague, which is quite fascinating. I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
It's really interesting. I think a lot, and I think about loneliness. I think about the former US Surgeon General in the US, Vivek Murthy, and he has talked about loneliness as the pandemic of loneliness. And interestingly, when he talks about potential solutions to the challenges around loneliness, he talks about the power of spiritual health. And I love that language and framing of thinking about spiritual health. And I think there's a huge increase in people using AI as tools for processing so much of what's going on in their lives. We're seeing a lot of increase in using AI as a tool for coaching and therapy and friendship and even romantic relationships, as well as colleagues for work. And I think that there's actually a lot of really powerful benefits of that in terms of it. I've experimented with using it as I'm trying to make decisions around things, and it just having a sounding voice to actually tune into one's own perspective and to have a mirror to be reflecting back. So I think on the one hand, there are these really powerful ways, and I think on the work front, being able to have ways of iterating very quickly around different ideas in a way that maybe working with other people could be a bit slower sometimes, and not as a replacement engaging with other people, but rather as a here are some insights that we can then build from in real life with other humans. And I think it's where it doesn't then lead to that next step. So it becomes like just with AI, and that there isn't always, I think, a consideration of the privacy issues and security and the addiction challenges, and the idea that there are some issues, I think, particularly when it comes to deep loneliness and deep depression, that actually working with clinical therapists that are medically trained, can have a benefit that sometimes the technology isn't able to fully encapsulate. So I think similar to many of these themes that we're talking about, of how do we build from some of these positive elements, but also recognize that we need to be able to have ways of protecting against the harm. And we, of course, see really tragic cases of when people have engaged with AI and then gone on to do really bad things as a result. So it's holding both of those realities, and I think it's a responsibility of all of us to be engaging around these topics.
Jenna, I want to dive into the HEAL model that you have in your book. HEAL, which stands for Hope, Empathy, Abundance, and Legacy. Let's dive into each one of these dimensions, please. And for each one, can you suggest 2 or 3 actions that leaders can take to transform their thinking and their business?
Yeah, so this framework was really came to me as I was interviewing different investors and business leaders for the book, and really kept emerging these themes around hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy. So it's definitely a framework that I find myself coming back to. So starting with hope, and when we think about hope, really think about it less just as sort of passive wishful thinking, but rather as a cognitive behavioral process that involves goal setting, agency, and building pathways. And Brené Brown talks about the idea of microdosing hope. And I love that imagery in terms of this really being a daily practice. And I think this is something that we can all, in our own ways, whether it's through journaling and using that as a mechanism for coming back to hope, or I think of an example that I share in the book of an incredible entrepreneur, Scott Schickler, that built a company called Seven Mindsets in the education technology space. And he's built and sold a number of companies in the education technology space. And I asked him about, how does he cultivate hope on a daily basis, particularly given the ups and downs of entrepreneurship. And he shared that he has a wand on his desk, and he finds that when he's in more of a scarce way of thinking about things or more fear-based, he literally waves the wand and it helps him to cultivate a sense of hope. And I love that example because I think it's something that we can all get a wand on our desk or something equivalent to be able to remind us of this power of hope. And there's a concept in the Baha'i writings around the forces of disintegration and integration in the world. And so much of what we see on a daily basis with the news and have you these forces of disintegration, and this idea of the practice of how are we orienting towards the forces of integration and really being part of creating forces of integration, initiatives around integration, but also focusing our attention in those areas. So that's when I think about hope. When I think about empathy, I had shared earlier around the example of devoted health and imagining that the people that we're engaging with are part of our beloved family. I think all of these practices that enable us to be able to, rather than see people as strangers and out there, how do we see them as part of our community? And there's this passage from Edward Markham where he said, "He drew a circle and shut me out, but love and wit had the will to win. I drew a circle and drew him in." And I think this idea of how are we creating these ever widening circles of people to engage in the work together becomes a really important aspect of that. And there's also a line in the Baha'i writings that says, "Let your heart burn with loving kindness for all who may cross your path." This idea of what would it look like if, when we're engaging with strangers, we were to engage with them with our heart burning with loving kindness. And I love that imagery and often come back to that. And this really leads to the third element of the framework, abundance. And we had talked a bit earlier in reflecting around my grandmother around the power of enoughness, and really see this interconnection between cultivating more of a sense of abundance with this concept of enoughness. And a friend of mine, Elizabeth Husserl, wrote a book called The Power of Enough. And I think an exercise that we can all do is to ask ourselves, what does enough mean for us? And we're in this often, and particularly in Western societies, in this sort of constant pursuit of more, but being able to actually take stock of what is enough, both individually and organizationally and really collectively, and how do we engage from that place. And this comes to the final part of the framework, legacy. And we had talked a bit about the idea of 7 generations thinking. There's a story that I start the book with that I often come back to when thinking about legacy. And it's from Wayne Silby, who's the founder of the Calvert Fund. So I had a chance to work with for a number of years. And he started the Calvert Funds in the late 1970s. And he started it initially as a money market fund. Shortly after he started the fund, they were doing very well financially. He went to a Buddhist retreat. And at the retreat, they had them reflect on what would it say on your tombstone. And his reflection was, it would say, the man that made 2% more than the next man. And he was thinking, this isn't really the legacy that I want to leave. And so he went back to his colleagues and that we need to make this socially responsible. And it's now a $45 billion firm and really been a pioneer in the area of social responsible investing. And I love that story and example. And I think it ties back to a practice that we can all engage with, which is thinking about what do we want to say on our tombstones and how do we hold that conception within the decisions that we're making. Those are a few reflections. It's a big part of the book is kind of diving more into some of those elements, but yeah, it's been a framework that I definitely come back to a lot.
Since the last point you talked about contemplating our mortality and our legacy, what legacy do you hope to leave behind? And what would your tombstone say?
So my book is dedicated to my mother and grandmother, and I would hope that my tombstone would say she honored the legacy of her ancestors. And I think a lot about both my mother and grandmother, but also other ancestors and how to hold all of the work that they did and all of the foundation that they created that has enabled me to do what I've been trying to do in my life. I think about a big part of my orientation, with the investment work that I engage in with Lightpost and Capital and with the facilitation work with Impact Experience is really as living laboratories for the application of so many of the principles that we're talking about. So how do we think about integrating more of a focus around purpose and spirituality into the essence of the organizations that we build? And my hope would be that the legacy that creates is more of a normalization around some of these principles.
Jenna, if you could give our audience a challenge for this week based on everything we have discussed, what would that challenge be?
The challenge would be to really think about what is the trace that we're trying to leave. So there's a line in the Baha'i writings, and it says, every choice we make as employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary leaves a trace. And the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims. So this question around what is the trace that we're hoping to leave, and that's relevant no matter what role we may play within society or within an organization, as an employee or an employer. And I have a post-it note on my fridge which says, what is the trace that you're leaving today? So I think asking that question and thinking about that and being attentive to what you're learning in the process of reflecting on that question as well.
Amazing. Jenna, once again, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you today. And I encourage everybody to get your amazing book. Thank you so much, Jenna, for bringing so much light into this world. Keep shining.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.